Okay, we'd like to turn to Psalm 1. First Psalm. Familiar passage to most. Psalm 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight, that is, this man that is blessed, is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. This is a very instructional psalm. Teaches us how to make the most out of life, how to be stable in a world of instability, how to be spiritually consistent, reliable, productive in this world. It reveals the secret of true happiness. We see here the characteristics of both the way of the righteous and the ungodly. It is a psalm not only instructional, but it's a psalm of encouragement to live life with God. It's also a psalm of warning about a certain spirit and certain manner of living. But most of all, it is a psalm of contrasts. We see there's a contrast in two characters, two lifestyles, and two results of these lifestyles. So the psalm illustrates two lives or two ways of living. It's a very probing psalm. The psalm serves as an indicator, a standard of measurement, and a test to our own spirit and manner of living. So this first psalm is basically a tale of two lives. We see two portraits, if you will. One of a blessed man, verse 1. Also, he's referred to as the righteous in verse 6. And then the other is the ungodly, who's referred to in verse 4, 5, and 6. We want to take our thought from the contrasts that are made between the righteous and the ungodly, and from the contrast of the way of the righteous and the way of the ungodly, and from the contrast of the results of these. Strictly speaking, the righteous are saved. There is a sense in which all the saved are righteous. And then, of course, there's the ungodly. That would refer to the unsaved. All the unsaved are ungodly. However, the saved can and sometimes do fall into the attitudes, the habits, and the lifestyles of the ungodly. So our subject this evening is planted or blown about. Planted or blown about. So let's look first at the contrast of characters. These two are polar opposites. We have the righteous, we have the ungodly. We're not going to say much about the ungodly. The psalm really doesn't. But consider the righteous. Again, these first and foremost are the saved. They have been declared to be right, and they have been made right by the grace of God. They are justified freely by the grace of God through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. They are the recipients of the grace of God. They have been changed by the grace of God. The word righteous describes their character and their disposition by grace. It describes the identity that grace has given them. Now, in this first psalm, they are presented as the antithesis of the ungodly. And the righteous, they have an attitude of reverence toward God. They are in a state of devotion to God. They have a consciousness, they have an awareness, they have an acknowledgement of God. They have an attitude centered upon God. Their heart is occupied with God. They have a spirit of humility, a spirit of affection and dependence and submission and gratitude and obedience to God. And they manifest the fact that God has made an impression upon them. They manifest that they are the workmanship of God. Now, the ungodly most err greatly in their perception of the ungodly. Most, when they think of the ungodly, they think of outward vile or violent acts, and though such, of course, is ungodly and can characterize the ungodly, the word ungodly is far, far more extensive than just outward acts. In fact, the word ungodly really refers to the inward disposition. So consider the ungodly. You have the prefix un, indicating absence and reverse of whatever follows. In this case, godly. So the ungodly has reference to an absence, a non-existence of God and God-likeness in the individual. Paul describes it in Ephesians 2 and verse 12, the words, without God. When we were unsaved, we were without God. That is, we were apart from God. We were destitute of God. We were ungodly. We were absent. God was absent in our life. The word ungodly has reference to what all are by birth. Therefore, it speaks of the character, the disposition, the temperament of the natural man. He or she is ungodly. They live their life apart from God. It is a word that has reference to the attitude, the habits, the lifestyle of the unsaved or the natural man. The ungodly, again, are those who live their lives apart from God or at distance from God. They are those who live their lives ungodlike. They are ungodly. So you don't have to commit a vile act to be ungodly. Ungodly is inbred. In verse 1, there is a threefold terminology concerning the ungodly. You have the word ungodly, which refers to their inward character. You have the word sinners, which refers to the fact that they are transgressors and breakers of God's law. The reason they are sinners is because they are ungodly. We see they are also referred to as scoffers. That is, that refers to the expression of their contempt for God. So you have the ungodly, sinners, scoffers. One and the same. It's not three different individuals, it's the ungodly. And it's stated in verse 4, the ungodly are not so. So we have a contrast between the righteous and the ungodly, and this is stated very clearly in verse 4, the ungodly are not so. Everything that we read of the righteous man in verses 1 through 3, the ungodly are not so. The reason they are not so is because they're ungodly. That's their nature. They live their life apart from God. So again, whatever is said of the righteous in verses 1 through 3, not so of the ungodly. So we have this contrast between the righteous and the ungodly. Then we notice there's two ways of living contrasted. From verse 6, we see that both the righteous and the ungodly have a lifestyle. Notice what it says here in verse 6. You have the way of the righteous, and you have the way of the ungodly. Two phrases, the way of the righteous, the way of the ungodly. But notice the word in between those two phrases is but. The way of the righteous, the way of the ungodly. These two but, they are contrary. Not only are they contrary in their character, they are contrary in their lifestyles. There is a contrast. So we have the way of the righteous, the way of the ungodly. Now, a way is a method. You have the method of the righteous, you have the method of the ungodly. A way is a procedure, it's a means of living. So you have the procedure and means of living of the righteous, and you have the means or procedure of the ungodly. Both the righteous and the ungodly have a method, have a procedure, have a means of living life. We see a way also speaks of a habit. The righteous have certain habits. The ungodly have certain habits. A way speaks of a custom, a course, a direction in life. And the righteous have a custom and a course and a direction in life, and the ungodly have the same, a custom, a course, and a direction in life. But between the two is but. That is, they do not have the same course. They do not have the same lifestyle because they're different in character. We see also both the righteous and ungodly have a behavior. A way speaks of behavior. The righteous behave in a certain way, and the ungodly behave in a certain way. So we need to understand that the way of the righteous is not what makes them righteous. The fact that they are righteous determines their way. And the way of the ungodly is not what makes them ungodly. The fact that they are ungodly determines the way that they live. And we need to understand that. In other words, lifestyle manifests nature and character. The way someone lives does not make their character. It manifests their character. It manifests who they are. They live that way because that's who they are. That's who they are by nature. So we see the psalmist describes the way of the righteous by way of the negative in verse 1, by way of the positive in verse 2, and metaphorically in verse 3. So we want to look at this. The way of the righteous. Again, he describes it in three ways. By the negative in verse 1, by the positive in verse 2, and in verse 3 he describes metaphorically or the results of their lifestyle. First of all, we see the description in verse 1. It is a way, the way of the righteous has much opposition. Much opposition. It's brought forth in verse 1. The ungodly Those who live habitually with God removed from their attitudes, from their habits, from their life. They live life with God removed. The reason? Because they are ungodly. They are anti-godly. So we have the ungodly. They are also described as sinners. That is, those who in their attitudes, their habit, and life live in transgression and rebellion against God. They are ungodly sinners. They are also referred to as the scornful. That is, those who openly express in their attitudes, in their habits, and in their lives contempt for God. And they mock God, and they mock God's ways, scoffing and jesting at sin. All of these things are opposing forces. The ungodly, the sinners, the scornful. They are opposing forces. They obstruct and impede the life of the righteous. Now notice that the ungodly, in verse 1, have their counsel. These people who live apart from God have their counsel. That is, they have their opinions, they have their advice based upon their principles, their values, their goals, their standards, which are all separated and apart from God. So we have the counsel of the ungodly. Now notice also in verse 1, the sinner has their way, the way of sinners. The sinner has their way or their behavior and direction of life. And again, it is a behavior and direction of life apart from God. And then there are the scornful. And notice they have their seat. The ungodly have their counsel. The sinner has his way, and the scornful has a seat. Which means when you think of a seat, when you think of sitting, you're thinking about comfortable. They are comfortable in their defiance of God and His ways. Why are they comfortable in their defiance of God? Because they're ungodly. That's not what makes them ungodly. They are comfortable in their defiance of God and in defiance of God's ways because they are ungodly. So these are opposing forces to the life of the righteous. Now notice, the way of the righteous is separate and distinct from these opposing forces. Again, notice verse 1. There are three positive characteristics of the righteous, and they are presented from the negative, and they present a picture. They present a picture of separation from the ungodly. They present a picture of distinction from the ungodly. Now notice again verse 1. Three characteristics. And it's marked by three verbs. Walketh, standeth, and sitteth. The righteous, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. Again, the ungodly's counsel is apart from God. It's apart from God. The word walketh is indicative of a casual movement along the way. Just a casual movement. It is a series of steps. Blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. This righteous man does not put himself or herself in a position to be influenced by the outlook and the viewpoint of the ungodly. You and I should not be interested in the opinion and the viewpoint of the ungodly. We should not put ourselves in a position to be influenced by people who live their lives apart from God. Notice also, nor standeth, this is the second description or characteristic, nor standeth in the way of sinners. So we've gone from walking to standing. Walking is just casually moving along. To stand is a more fixed position. It is a more fixed position. It is a more fixed identification with them. You walk with the ungodly long enough and far enough, you will eventually stand with them. Walketh, standeth. To stand means there's now a delay. And it is a delay with them. A delay with the ungodly. It is a persisting with them. So it has gone from a casual walk with the ungodly to now a standing in the way of sinners. Notice also the third characteristic. Nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. 3 verbs. Walketh, standeth, sitteth. To sit is even a more settled position than to stand. And to sit is, again, there's a comfort zone that has now been established. To sit speaks of a resting place, a more comfortable position. So you have this, the righteous man does not casually walk along following the counsel of the ungodly. He does not sit or he does not stand in the way of sinners. And he does not sit in the seat of the scornful. So again, 3 verbs. Walketh, standeth, sitteth. Notice that all 3 are present tense. They're ongoing. From these we see a dangerous downward spiral in movement away from God, in movement toward the ungodly, and an identification with the ungodly. He does not walk in the counsel, in the opinions of those who live their lives apart from God. He does not stand with them, those who live their lives transgressing the laws of God. And they do not sit. And then we see the way of the righteous is that of an inward and continual saturation in verse 2. So he describes the righteous from the negative in verse 1. And then notice verse 2. But. That is, rather than walking, standing, and sitting with the ungodly, rather than doing that, he does something else, or there's something else going on inwardly. But his delight is in the law of the Lord. His delight is inward aspiration, his inward pleasure, his inward gratification, his inward joy, his inward satisfaction and love. It is present tense, ongoing, continually in the law. The law is the direction and instruction in the law of the Lord. Rather than walking in the counsel of the ungodly, he delights, he finds satisfaction in the direction and instruction of God. That will keep your life apart from the ungodly. And then something else he does. So his delight, that's inward. His delight is in the law of the Lord. And in his law, that is God's law, in his law doth, again present tense, he meditate. That is, rather than pondering the counsel of the ungodly, he ponders the law of God, the direction and the instruction of God. He carefully considers the instruction of the Lord, and he does this day and night. So his continual point of focus is the Word of God. So you read verse 2. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and his law doth he meditate day and night. In other words, this is his life over and over and over and over. He meditates in the law of God. He does not walk with the ungodly, in the counsel of the ungodly. He does not stand in the way of sinners. He does not sit in the seat of scornful. But rather than doing that, he meditates in God's direction, in God's instruction. In verse 2 is the remedy against the counsel of the ungodly. Verse 2 is the remedy against standing in the way of sinners. Verse 2 is the remedy against finding yourself sitting in the seat of the scornful, finding yourselves comfortable. The very moment you start getting comfortable with the ways of the ungodly, you are in serious trouble, whether you realize it or not. And most of God's people, that's where they are today. They sit in the seat of the scornful. They're comfortable there. They've walked long enough with them. They've walked long enough in their counsel. They've stood long enough with them that now they've sat down a while. And there they are sitting with them. And what happens? There's not much difference. You look at the lives today of those who profess to be saved and the lives of the unsaved, and I'm here to tell you there's not a whole lot of difference. There's not a whole lot of difference in the way they think. There's not a whole lot of difference in the way they do things. There's been an intermingling, just as it was prior to the flood. The sons of God married the daughters of men. There was an intermingling, and the distinction was broken down. And we see the same thing today. So consider the details of the way of the ungodly. It is described in 5 words in verse 4. The ungodly are, present tense ongoing, not so. The ungodly will walk in the counsel of the ungodly. The ungodly will stand in the way of sinners. The ungodly will sit in the seat of the scornful. The ungodly will not meditate day and night in the instruction of God. The ungodly are not so. They're not like the righteous. Then notice there's a contrast in the results of these two lifestyles. So for the child of God, these contrasts in results serve as a true test as to whether one possesses the character, the spirit, the habits, and the life of the righteous, or whether that righteous person has fallen into the spirit and the habits and the life of the ungodly. If we do not have these results, it's because we've fallen into the habits of the ungodly. Now notice what it says. Verse 1, there's a continuous happiness. Blessed is the man. This coincides with Christ's usage of the word blessed in the Sermon on the Mount. It's not referring to the blessings of salvation. It's referring to an inner condition of calm and joy and happiness, an inner condition of pleasure and satisfaction and delight. It conveys the idea of fullness of life, a deep sense of peace and contentment and well-being. This is more than times of happiness. This is a happiness that goes beyond circumstances. It's a happiness that goes beyond places to our liking and goes beyond our personal preferences being met and goes beyond the fulfillments and comforts of self. Blessed is the man. Again, blessed is. Present tense, continuous. This individual his life is marked by this peace and contentment and well-being. Blessed is. Everything that the word blessed conveys is over and over and over. That is, it just keeps on. Just keeps on. It is calm, joy, happiness, satisfaction, and delight over and over and over. It is fullness of life. It is a sense of peace, a sense of contentment, a sense of well-being over and over and over, regardless of circumstances, regardless of place. Now notice in verse 1, it is, blessed is the man that. Blessed is the man that. The word that indicates that this blessedness is the result of something. Blessed is the man that. You will not find this blessedness in the lifestyle of the ungodly. You will not find this blessedness walking in the counsel of the ungodly. You will not find this blessedness standing in the way of sinners. You will not find this blessedness sitting in the seat of the scornful. It is the result of not doing those things. And then notice verse 3, and he, the one described in verses 1 and 2, shall be like. And he shall, a word of certainty, he shall be. That's a state of existence. It's what he becomes. He shall be. You know, God's people today, they concentrate on doing, and they'd be better off if they concentrated on being. If you be the right thing, you will do the right thing. So we see, blessed is, and he shall be like. So a comparison is now being made. He shall be like. He shall possess the qualities of a tree. It doesn't say he shall be a tree. He shall be like a tree. A comparison. Notice that it's not just any tree, but he shall be like a tree planted. Planted. Conveying the idea of if you plant something, you chose what to plant. And you chose where to plant it. It speaks of a definite purpose. He shall be like a tree planted. And then notice what it says. He shall be like a tree planted by. That is, he has a very specific location. His location is not walking in the counsel of the ungodly. His location is not standing in the way of sinners. His location is not sitting in the seat of the scornful. His location is he's by the rivers of water, which of course is a source of life. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth, again, present tense, ongoing, continuously, forth his fruit in a very manifest way. So what we have here is a picture of continual outward growth and productivity, spiritually speaking. There is outward spiritual growth, outward spiritual productivity. He shall bring forth his fruit. But then notice what it says. In his season. Those three words are very important. In his season. Think about season. In his season. That speaks of consistency. He shall bring forth fruit in his season. Season after season after season. There's a consistency. The child of God does not find consistency walking in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standing in the way of sinners, nor sitting in the seat of the scornful. They find this consistency meditating in the direction and instruction of God, and they bringeth forth fruit in his season. It not only speaks of consistency, it speaks of dependability. You look at the particular season of that tree and you depend upon the fact there's going to be fruit there. There's fruit there this year and there's going to be fruit there next year. You can depend on it. It's consistent. And a lot of God's people, you can't depend on them any more than you can depend on the ungodly. Because they're living like the ungodly. So there's consistency, there's dependability. Notice something else. His leaf also. Also means in addition to. In addition to what? In addition to fruit producing. In addition to consistently producing fruit, his leaf also shall not. Again, another word of certainty, wither. It shall not become dry and shriveled up like the chaff. And if you want to prevent becoming dry and shriveled up spiritually, live in verse 1 and verse 2, and you can then get in verse 3. But verses 1 and 2 comes before verse 3. And then notice what it says. And, in addition to that, whatsoever he doeth shall prosper, shall flourish and thrive. He just continues to flourish and thrive spiritually. So what we have here is a life rooted to God. A life rooted to God. That's what we need. That's the solution. Our lives need to be rooted to God. That results in a fortified, stable, solid, strong, fruitful, prosperous, growing spiritually, even in days of difficulty. The days have no effect because we're rooted to God. We can't be rooted to the counsel of the ungodly, to the way of sinners, or to the seat of the scornful. We have to be rooted to God's Word, rooted to God, and then we will be consistent and we'll be stable. Again, none of this is speaking of isolated incidents. It is a consistent way of life. We've seen many people through the years come on the scene. And many times they come and, they seem so great. Give it a while. 6 months down the road, nowhere to be seen. Time will tell. Time will tell. You have to be spiritual to continue on consistently through the years. If you're not spiritual, you will not continue. You will not continue. You'll have spurts. You'll have every now and thens, but there's not a consistency. There's not a consistency of life. Then notice the result in closing, the results of the way of the ungodly. Verse 4, the ungodly are not so. And there it is again, but. In contrast, they are like, that is, they resemble and they possess the qualities of the chaff or the straw. Big difference between a tree planted by the rivers of water and the chaff. I mean, we're looking at two polar opposites. No similarities whatsoever. The chaff, unlike the tree, has no root. There's no root to God. Again, they're ungodly. They live their lives apart from God. They're not rooted to God. They have no fixed place. The tree is planted by the rivers of water. It has a fixed place. But the chaff has no fixed place. The chaff is unstable. The chaff is separated from the source of life, separated from the source of strength. And as a result, it's dead, it's dry, and it's helpless. Notice what happens to the chaff, which the wind's always changing. So the wind here pictures the always changing elements and surrounding circumstances, which the wind driveth away. The chaff has no stability, and the chaff cannot endure the always changing elements and circumstances. What can we endure? What can we do? God's people have to endure. God's people are called upon to endure. And many who profess to be God's people can't endure anything. They can't endure the slightest change in their circumstance. Not the slightest change. They can't handle it. And why is that? Well, it's because they're the opposite of verses 1 and 2. They're the opposite of verse 3. And they're driven. They're controlled by circumstances. Their moods are controlled by circumstances. Their moods, their attitudes, everything about them, their joy, their happiness. Everything is under the control and mastery of the ever-changing elements and circumstances. They're up and down, up and down. But the righteous, he's like that tree. Just consistent. Always producing fruit in season. But the ungodly, their feelings, their moods, their attitudes, their behaviors are dictated and measured by circumstances, and they are carried about by the elements and circumstances of life. And if that is true, if you're carried about by circumstances, you're not going to be happy. Not consistently. This blessed man, he's happy consistently. But the picture of the chaff, driven and controlled by the wind, I see that as a life squandered. The truth is, if we don't live in verses 1 and 2, we squander our life away. It is a life squandered. It's a life misspent. Life is of tremendous value. And we all live life. We all live the life that God has given us. And many misspend the life. They misspend it. You may misspend a day. You'll never get that day back. You may misspend a week. You'll never get that week back. You may misspend months and years. You'll never get them back. Never. You can get right and live the rest of your life right, but you'll never get back what you've misspent. It's a picture of a life misused and thrown away. That's not why God saved us. God didn't save us so we can squander our life. He didn't save us so we can misuse and throw away our life. And the life of the ungodly, they live their life apart from God. It's a life misspent. It's a life misspent. So personal examination is needed. Am I, over and over and over, like a tree planted near to God, or am I like the chaff carried about by the ever-changing elements? Tree planted or chaff driven by the wind? We're one or the other. Which is it? Are we a tree planted? Or are we like the chaff? It speaks loud and clear of our spiritual condition, whether we be the tree planted or the chaff. And the way to avoid becoming chaff driven by the wind is verse 1 and 2. That's how you avoid that life. We could all become chaff. The way to avoid it is live in verses 1 and 2. Remember, no matter how intelligent the ungodly are, in their counsel it is apart from God. You need to always remember that. It is apart from God. And always remember the sinner has his way of living, and there is the seat of the scornful. People get comfortable. People get comfortable with the ungodly. We all have, sadly. You could use many, many examples. But we have a tendency to get comfortable with wickedness. Once it's around a while, abortion's one of the perfect examples. People get comfortable. Oh, I'm against it. Yeah, but not like you were 15 years ago. Not to the same level. Not to the same level when it first started happening. Same with other sins as well. They're around long enough, and pretty soon we learn to accept them. It's dangerous. It's very, very, very dangerous. And it has an adverse effect upon our spirituality. And when our spirituality is adversely affected, that puts us even in more danger. And the danger just keeps increasing. And what you see today is a breakdown of the distinction between saved and unsaved. A breakdown of the distinction between truth and error. Truth and error. Sin and righteousness. These things are broken down. People no longer see the distinction as clearly as they ought to. And it's because of a failure to live in verses 1 and 2. So God help us to live in verses 1 and 2. God help us to do that. And Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song. Let's all stand. And Ben will lead us in singing.